Hello and welcome to my Powtoon on Misleading Graphs. I hope you enjoy. This Powtoon will look at what is meant by misleading graphs, how misleading graphs are created, and finally, why it is important to be aware of misleading graphs. Graphs are pictorial representations of numbers. Therefore, representation of the numbers should be proportional to the numbers themselves. However, this is not always the case. Any graph that distracts the reader from fully understanding what he or she is viewing can be considered misleading. For example, graphs with no title, graphs with no label on the axis, graphs with a dependent variable axis that doesn't start at 0, and graphs with no key when one is required are all examples of misleading graphs. Let's have a look at an example. The bars in the graph suggest that Mary's Instagram followers in 2017 were 5 times the amount of followers than 2014. But this is misleading. That is because the dependent variable axis, which in this case is the vertical axis, does not start at 0. The vertical axis starts at 300. And at a closer glance, we see that in 2014, Mary had 350 followers, and in 2017, she had 600. Now, although she did have more followers in 2017 in comparison to 2014, it is only a difference of 250, not 5 times the amount of people. Not starting the dependent variable axis at 0 is a common misconception within graphing. As we often discuss scaling graphs to fit the data, students think it is okay to start the vertical axis at a stage that suits their data. This is not the case, and we'll have a look why. If we have a look at the previous misleading graph in comparison to a graph with the same data that is not misleading, we can see how easy it is to correct the common misconception of not starting the dependent variable axis at 0 and the effect it has on the graph. This graph depicts the same data as the misleading graph before. However, it is not misleading. That is because the dependent variable axis, the number of followers are dependent on the year, begins at 0. Furthermore, the vertical axis, which is the dependent variable axis, is scaled correctly, in that it increases by even intervals all the way to the top. And when the bars for each year are filled in, we see that although there was an increase between 2014 and 2017, the increase is not nearly as dramatic as the original misleading graph would suggest. Scaling is not to be mistaken with starting your vertical axis at whatever stage suits your data. Scaling refers to maintaining even intervals along both axes. For a bar graph to provide a representative impression of the values being plotted, the visual weight of each bar must be proportional to the value of the bar. Setting the axis above 0 interferes with this, and thus, when creating a bar graph, the dependent variable axis must include 0. Let's have a look at another example of a misleading graph, this time in the form of a pictograph. Can you see why this graph is misleading? The graph provides images next to a country title depicting we don't know what, as the graph is not labeled. For Russia, the picture of 1 medal corresponds to almost 20 medals. We would expect the picture of 3 medals to correspond to almost 60 medals and the picture of 4 medals to correspond to almost 80 medals. However, the label for the 3 medal picture is 27 and for the 4 medal picture is 46. Although there is a correct ranking ordering, there is little relationship between the pictures of the medals and the labels and the number of medals. The pictures are of different value for each country, and even if they were the same, there is no key to explain. This is yet another frequent misconception that leads to misleading graphs. Students often find writing labels and titles for graphs redundant and unnecessary. Furthermore, they know what the pictures represent, so find providing a key pointless. Without labels, titles, and keys, pictographs do not make a lot of sense. Let's have a look at our previous misleading graph in comparison to a graph depicting the same data and is not misleading. We can see how easy it is to correct the common misconceptions of not including labels, titles, and keys and the effect it has on the graph. By adding a title, we can see the pictograph represents the countries that won the most gold medals in the 2016 Olympic Games. The label explains the fact that the medals represent the medals won in 2016. And finally, the key indicates how many medals each medal represents. The picture in the middle holds the same value for each country, and therefore the graph is a far more accurate depiction of the data and is not misleading. The misconception of not having to include a key can lead to larger mistakes, like the pictures not holding the same value. This mistake has been rectified. Picture graphs must include a title, labels, and a key. Not including these can lead to further mistakes, such as the pictures holding different values, which in turn leaves you with a misleading graph. Misleading graphs are not always made accidentally. They can be created to hinder the proper interpretation of data. For example, the German Economic Development Agency published this graph to boast that German workers work more hours than other EU nations. Can you see a problem with this graph? Is it misleading? Perhaps now that it's a bit more zoomed in, you can see why it's misleading. The dependent variable axis does not start at 0. And by being aware of the fact that this is misleading, you're far less likely to buy into what the publishing body is attempting to convey. This is what the graph looks like when the dependent variable axis starts at 0 and increases by even intervals. Now the difference between countries does not seem nearly as drastic. By being aware of how misleading graphs can affect how the data is interpreted, I would also hope that you pay closer attention to the common misconceptions that were discussed earlier that can lead to creating a misleading graph. Thank you for taking the time to watch my Powtoon.